Hi there, chess fans. This is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to continue our series on the our super fast Sicilian series. This is our second video on the Najdorf, and it may not be our last one. We'll see. So we'll at least get through bishop e2, bishop to e3, and f3. Whether we get to bishop g5 or not, let's see. But I suspect that'll probably have to wait for still a fourth show. But then that'll be it. Okay, so let's start right away here. All right, so bishop to e2. This used to be the main move for a long time. White's playing kind of a restrained system. Just going to develop his king side and see where things go from there. Now, black can play e6, and we're back into a Scheveningen, or a Scheveningen, as I guess it's supposed to be. The less I have to say that, the better off I think we'll all be. In any case, e6 is certainly playable here. But that transposes to a different system. So if we want to have a really Najdorf approach, also knight c6 could be played too, but this would just go into a classical Sicilian. So the Najdorf move is it's the pawn to e5. And now white has a fundamental choice to make here. So knight to b3 is the most common move, but knight to f3 is also played frequently and very significant. And the idea of this move is white's going to go for a system where he's ultimately trying to play for domination over the d5 square. Now it's a little bit funny in a way, because even if the knight's on b3, it could still go bouncing to d2 to c4 or to f1, from there to e3 and to d5. But it just seems to happen much more frequently with this knight on f3. And I'm actually not entirely sure why this is. It seems like the knight to b3 system could go in the same direction. And I have seen knight to b3 games where white has tried to achieve that, but it just doesn't seem to work as cleanly. One reason why I think is that, okay, on knight to b3, this bishop, black can put a bishop on e6 much more readily, whereas here, if black were to play bishop to e6, knight to g5 would be very annoying. So that's, I think, one reason why this knight f3 system is a more effective way of trying to go for this d5 square domination. All right, well here black's best move is probably h6. And the idea of this is to prevent one fundamental aspect of the plan, which is bishop g5, and then at some point taking the knight on f6 to get rid of this dark square bishop, which obviously can't ever directly fight for the d5 square, while getting rid of a piece that can. So black plays h6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, and play very often goes something like this. Alright, so here we can see that black really doesn't have any problems with d5 from the standpoint that white really can't put a piece on d5 and keep piece control there. So he can play knight to d5, but he'll end up with a pawn there, as opposed to a minor piece, which would be kind of the fantasy. All right, nevertheless, this position is quite playable for white, and knight to d5 is the move here. Black takes, and now white plays c4. And so the big idea for white in this system is to try to use these four queenside pawns to create this big bind. And I would suggest looking at the games from the 1999 FIDE Knockout Championship between Dibyendo Barua of India and Alexander Halifman of Russia, who ended up winning the event. But he had a terrible time against Barua. I mean, he lost 2 or 3 games to him in the event in this system. And, Barua just kept slowly but surely grinding him to death in this variation. And Halifman had to keep fighting from behind. I mean, it was probably his toughest match of the entire event. And ironically, it was against maybe the lowest rated player. I mean, Barua was a good grandmaster, still is, but was the weakest, I think, of all of his opponents in the tournament, but proved to be the toughest. At any rate, in this position, black has his trumps too. Of course, he's got this nice e5 pawn, and at some point would like to join it with the f pawn and try to use his kingside / central majority. For black here, probably the first thing he should do is play a5, trying to create some kind of dark squared blockade to make it difficult for white to advance. I mean, you can see things like maybe b6 and some piece goes to the c file, the knight goes to c5, and so on. So black tries to slow up white on the queen side and judiciously advance his kingside pawns. Of course, white's going to try to do something similar, but the inverse. Okay, so that's knight f3. Now, about knight to b3. This is a line that Geller, the great Ukrainian grandmaster, made or had tremendous success with in the 60s in particular. He had a lot of good results against Bobby Fischer, for example, in the candidates in Curaçao. And later on, in the early 70s, early to mid 70s, Anatoly Karpov found some new ways to revitalize the variation, perhaps in part under the influence of Geller, who worked as his second on a number of occasions. So bishop to e7 is most accurate here. It's more accurate than bishop to e6. So castles, castles. And now we have this kind of battle of the tempo. So the battle of the tempo is most famous from certain Queen's Gambit decline positions, but we have it here too. White wants to play f4 most of the time, not always, but it's one of the typical ideas. And he'd like to do it if he can without moving this bishop to e3 first. So if we can play f4 straight away, great. But it turns out it's not quite so easy to achieve this. So for example, the immediate f4, here b5 is plenty good. So black is ready to play b4, and also this bishop can come to b7. So there's another little waiting game here, which is that white would like to wait for black to play bishop to e6 before he plays f4. So you can see there's going to be this kind of pausing around. So if we play bishop to e3, of course, then we've given up the battle of the tempo. So on bishop to e3, well, now black plays bishop to e6. We'll come back to this in a moment. So another attempt to make a clever waiting move here for white is king to h1. And now, okay, if bishop to e6, then sure enough, white does play f4. So he got what he wanted, because now he's going to play f5 and kick this bishop again. So black usually plays queen c7. White can play a4 or even the immediate f5. And let's say bishop to c4. And now instead of a4, white can even play g5. And we can see already this domination of d5 is becoming a possibility. It's going to play g5, swap this, put the knight on d5. So here I think black's main move is to play d5, but still g5, knight e4, knight takes e4, d takes e4, and now f6. And this is somewhat unpleasant. It's not winning for white, but it's at least pleasant for him. So black has some strategic worries in this variation. So the immediate bishop to e6 isn't best. Nor is b5 ideal here. So with white's pawn not committed to f4, the idea of bishop to b7 with the idea of pressuring this e-pawn really isn't quite as fantastic as it might seem either. And white can play well with a4 here. Now, normally this wouldn't be any great shakes, but and if black's bishop were already on b7, this would be nothing special either. But here it is. So b4, knight to d5. And now, okay, if knight takes d5, then no problem here. Simply queen takes d5 is unpleasant. So white is keeping piece control, and black has to awkwardly put the rook on a7, which isn't really all that desirable. Bishop goes to e3. White seems to have some edge here. Okay, if bishop to b7, then white just at least gets the bishop pair, plays f3, say d5, takes, bishop g5, and again with the bishop pair, white has reasonable chances for an edge. Okay, well, what about the obvious move? Knight takes e4. Well, here we see that with the bishop not on b7 yet, black has some problems. So bishop to f3, and now, well, what does black do? If he retreats the knight, of course, this is terrible. It's just a blunder, but already he's in trouble. Maybe it's sort of the blunder's already been made. So we can take on e7 or take on f6, and then we grab the rook. But as I said, what's black to do? If he plays f5, then knight takes, queen d5 check, and again, the rook on a8 is falling. Likewise, okay, if bishop to f5, takes, queen d5, and again, there's a double attack here, and there's the threats, the rook on a8. I suppose black can actually wriggle here, so I hadn't really paid attention to this before, but okay, there's knight to d7, bishop b4, knight f6. But still, I mean, after queen takes a8, rook a8, bishop a8, white's got pretty nice material here. So he's got two rooks and a bishop for a queen and a pawn. And, all right, maybe black has a little compensation with bishop takes c2, but certainly doesn't seem to me to be enough. Maybe white has something better. Nah, I don't see anything better, but that looks pretty effective. Black is certainly in trouble there. Okay, so b5 is a mistake because a4 is quite effective. Even if black doesn't play b4, he's got some difficulties here. Maybe you can try bishop to b7. So the counterattacking approach. This is probably better, but here too, white seems to have a nice position after knight to d5. So if knight takes d5, e takes d5, b4, a5 is quite effective, artificially isolating this pawn here on b4. And, okay, don't really want to go into this line in too much depth, but the point is if black doesn't take on d5, white will again probably play something like knight takes e7 check, and then f3 with the bishop pair, possibly transposing to the line that we saw earlier. Okay, so after king h1, b5 isn't so fantastic, but black has this neat move b6. And the idea is to play bishop to b7 and only then play b5 when those tactical tricks on the long diagonal no longer work for white. So let's say bishop to e3. Remember, f4 is not so exciting when black hasn't committed the bishop to e6. So bishop to e3, bishop b7, f3, not really anything clearly better, and now b5. So there's no longer any bishop to f3 things to worry about, or queen to d5 forking tricks, none of that. So after a4, b4, knight to d5, takes and takes. Here black can play either knight to d7. Okay, this does allow a5, but here a5 isn't as significant. White's pieces aren't quite as well coordinated as they were before. So after something like rook to c8, black is in decent shape. But black can also just play a5 here, so he doesn't even have to allow the a5 clamp or think about that. All right, and so here white plays either c4 or c3. So c4 or c3. So we'll put that there for you to look at. Okay, so going back now. So that is king h1 and then b6. So we looked at f4, we saw that that's not so great because of b5. We looked at king h1 and saw that b6 probably contained that move. So back to bishop b3. So bishop b3, giving up the battle with the f4 move. Now black plays bishop to e6. And then here, okay, f4 is a bit more old-fashioned, or a4. So a4 was the old-fashioned move. That was popular in the 60s. It looks like black is fine after, for example, knight b to d7. Okay, a5, just continuing the old-fashioned approach. And now rook c8. Say queen d2, queen c7. And anyway, black is fine. This is, again, kind of old school stuff here. Or f4 in this position is also important. So here, black takes, let's say bishop takes, rook takes can be played too. Knight c6, let's say king h1, getting out of the way of queen b6 tricks. Rook c8, queen e1, and okay, one of the ideas for black is to play knight e8 with the idea of bishop f6 and bishop to e5. So rook to e1, bishop h4 actually is a neat little finesse, can be played to kick the queen away, and then bishop f6, say queen e3, queen e7 getting off the d file, knight d5 takes, and knight e5. Okay, just as an example, and black is in decent shape here. So the key thing is that black gets a lot of good control over a bunch of dark squares, and this helps to compensate for a slight lack of space and sometimes this weakness of f5. All right, so again, that's kind of the old-fashioned thing. So queen of d2 is a little bit more newfangled. say knight b to d7, a4, rook c8, a5. So this kind of transposes, queen c7. In fact, it exactly transposes to a position we had with a4 instead of queen to d2. Now we'll see a little bit more. So one move that white sometimes plays here is rook f to c1, preparing for this knight to go jumping someplace like d5 without worrying about the c2 pawn. And, okay, the other idea is rook f to d1. Okay, so say rook f to d8, queen e1, queen c6, bishop f3, h6, and now an interesting move for white. See if you can figure out what this is. And it does confirm something that I mentioned before, that white can play for the d5 square with the knight on b3. It doesn't have to always be on f3. So here the move is knight c1, with the idea of knight 1 to a2, knight to b4, and the knight finally leaping into the d5 square. So you can examine this further, but this at least I think should give you some ideas about how the bishop to e2 lines run. Okay, so now we move to a super sharp system, which really wasn't very well known for a long time. I mean, it was really Robert Byrne, and then later a bunch of other players who made this popular. So the move is bishop to e3. Okay, now e6 is possible. Well, okay, there are actually a bunch of moves that are possible. So one move that's kind of becoming popular nowadays, maybe not in this exact move order, but hereabouts, is g6. So this kind of Najdorf system where black combines Najdorf and dragon development. I don't really want to say anything about this. It's new, it's becoming interesting, but it's still kind of a little bit of a backwater, and the theory is not that well developed with it yet. Another possibility for black is knight to c6. After f3, we're more or less in a classical Sicilian, not a Najdorf. Okay, so the three main approaches here for black are e6, which goes into a Scheveningen again. There's e5, which is the main Najdorf approach. And there's knight to g4, which is a kind of funky attempt to be disruptive. So let's go through these last three moves one at a time and start with e6. Now here, if white plays bishop to e2, then we're back into regular Scheveningen waters with the 6 bishop to e2 line. So I won't say anything further about that. I've already discussed it some in a previous video. A really exciting line, which is attributed to the Hungarian international master Bela Perenyi, starts with g4. And it's pretty reminiscent of the Keres attack against the Scheveningen, but a little bit different. There's a key tactical point that's available here, but not there. So black can play h6, and this probably will transpose into a straight Keres attack. But with e5, things get very, very hairy. Okay, knight f5 is the standard move. Black can play h5. In fact, I think Robeson played this the other day in the U.S. Championship. But the really dramatic stuff occurs with g6. Now, white can play, and the point here, and what's not available here that is available in the corresponding Scheveningen position, without the black pawn on a6 and the white bishop on e3, is that white could play knight to e3. Not here, though. So here, the knight either has to retreat, in which case he loses the g4 pawn, or the knight just gets sacrificed. Oh, one other point clearly is that if the pawn's not on a6, white has bishop to b5 check, and that's also a nice move for him to make. All right, so actually knight c6, then maybe it's not as great. That's only when the knight's back on d4 that would be an issue. Anyway, back to this. Bishop to g2 can be played. This is an interesting refinement, but I don't want to discuss this. I'll just let you know that it's there and it is significant. But g5 is the most common move and certainly the hairiest. So g takes f5, e takes f5, and now black doesn't bother moving his knight either, but plays d5. So threatening a counter fork. So wins a piece, gives it back, but he's going to get it back again after g takes f6, d4. But this is very, very interesting here. So now white plays bishop to c4 with the point that, okay, if black takes either piece, let's say d takes e3, then bishop f7 and queen takes d8. So black plays queen to c7 here, threatening a third piece, no less. So now we've got this fork, and this is hanging, and now the bishop takes f7, queen takes d8 idea is no longer on. So queen to d3, d takes e3, castles. All right, so now black's position looks very precarious. Remarkably, the right move for him here is e takes f2. The reason why this is important is that it's important to take over the g1 and e1 squares to keep rooks from doing dangerous things there. So now the variation continues like this. Bishop takes f7 check. Okay, of course queen takes is impossible because of queen to d8 mate. So king takes f7, check, takes, check, bunch of checks, and now queen to d2. So the idea is to play queen g5 check. So queen b6 takes here. And now it would be nice if white, for example, still had a pawn on f2 and could play f takes e3, so the f file would be wide open. But proves not so simple. Okay, so also rook h to f1, bishop h6, small threat here. Rook takes f2, king e8, and the theory actually continues from here. So there have been a number of games, and the score is 50%, so it's likely that there are some forced draws in this position. I'll leave them to you to figure out how they go. But still a very exciting, very dynamic position. Obviously, preparation is paramount if you want to go down these lines. All right. So that going back to d5, what we just saw was g takes f6, d4, bishop c4, and so on. But white has another important move here, which is queen f3. So he doesn't take the knight and doesn't even directly stop the fork with d4. Instead, the idea is that after d4 he can castle long and bring still another piece into the attack. All right. There's plenty of theory here. I'll just show you one main variation. Knight b to d7, developing a piece, blocking the d file. Bishop to d2, keeping this bishop alive. Queen c7, gf, takes the knight and recaptures. So black's still up a piece here, but only for a couple of pawns. And black's king is, to some extent, stuck in the center, since castling kingside doesn't look all that attractive. So queen c6, and all of a sudden it looks as if black is okay. I mean, white doesn't want to trade queens, but if he doesn't, then queen takes h1. But it turns out that queen takes h1 isn't very good. And I believe this occurred in a game between Shirov and Van Wely. Actually, they've had a couple of games from this variation. One of them, Van Wely grabbed the rook and got killed. Another game, he didn't take it, but ended up getting killed later on. Anyway, bishop to h6, I believe, is the believed to be the correct move here. Bishop f4, queen d3, and there have been a number of games from here. Again, fun for you to look at. Queen takes h1, I think, has been played, but I'm not sure that it's considered the right move. Yeah, I think the right move here is, or at least the main move here, is to castle, and then after rook to g1 to hide over on h8. And here white plays bishop to b4, and so on. So you can look that up on your own. Lots of fun, though. Very interesting chess, obviously. So that's g4 here. Okay, the main move, though, is f3. And now we have what's called the English attack. And it's only the English attack if black has played e6. So white's setup looks really similar, whether black plays e6 or e5. I mean, he's still going to play, okay, after the knight retreats in this case, he's still going to go for this f3, queen d2, g4 jazz, and try to blow black off of the board. But here I think it's best called the Byrne system, B-Y-R-N-E, after the American Grandmaster Robert Byrne. Whereas in the e6 variations, in the Scheveningen move order, it's the English attack. Okay, well, let's have a quick look at a little bit of it. I don't really want to say too much. I mean, there's tons and tons of theory on this, so I'm just going to give some very general ideas. Okay, white has two main moves here, and for a while there was a big debate over whether white should play queen to d2 first or play g4 first, and likewise in the e5 lines. So I won't say too much about it here. I'll say a little bit about it in the other case. So after g4, black can play a bunch of different moves. The main choices are h6, simply preventing g5 for the moment, or at least preventing it from doing anything too serious. There's bishop to b7, and the point of this is not just to develop, but to leave the d7 square free, so that way, if g5, black can play knight f to d7. So usually white plays queen to d2 here, waiting on black. And in fact, black's most common move here plays h6 sometimes, but it's just knight f to d7, leaving without even being kicked. So he can play knight to b6 and then bring this knight to d7. Ultimately, one way or another, in many of these variations, you're going to have one knight on b6 and one knight on d7, and it's going to take the exact same number of moves, whichever knight ends up on whichever square. So it's not necessarily bad for black to just move this knight from f6 without even being chased, especially since white generally wants to play g5 at some point anyway. Okay, the point being that if you play knight b to d7 right here, well, then g5 takes away the possibility of bringing that knight over to the queen side, so it'll have to go to h5. All right. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about that. So that we've looked at h6 very briefly and bishop to b7. Okay, also possible is the immediate knight f to d7, and then finally b4, kicking white's knight and leaving white with the choice whether to bring the knight to e2 or to a4, and both moves have been played. Okay, so queen d2 I think is more common, and now is a sample variation. Okay, knight b to d7, g4. Okay, black can play knight to b6 here, but the most common move I think is h6. And now what follows is a variation that was incredibly popular around the turn of the century, and I think it's still considered important, but it's not as popular as it was, certainly. So castles, bishop b7, h4, b4. So there's still no threat of g5 and h takes g5 because the rook on h1 is hanging. So knight a5, knight a4, queen a5, b3, knight c5. And I think I mentioned last time something about a white pawn on b4, when white castles queenside, being kind of strange, but that there's a variation where it's popular. Well, this is it. So a3, knight takes a4, ab, queen c7, ba4. And this looks kind of crazy for white. I mean, he's up a pawn, sure, but those pawns being advanced, I mean, makes the position look pretty airy over there. But it turns out that it's really not so bad. So black plays d5, white plays e5 with a simple little tactic that if queen takes e5, bishop f4 is goodbye queen. Well, goodbye piece. I mean, I guess black can play bishop takes b4 or knight to e4, but losing a piece either way. So after e5, knight to d7. Now white does play f4 because knight takes e5 was a threat. Knight to b6. And then here white either plays rook to h3, preparing to help the lateral defense with the rook on the third rank, or f5, going for full-fledged blood over on the king side. And very, very exciting line. A lot of perpetual check variations, but still, I think, scope for discovery. At least the last time I checked. I don't think this was a solved position from what I recall, but maybe it has been solved in the meantime. All right, well, that's all I wanted to say about e6 here. Back on move 6. So now let's talk about e5, so the burn attack. Now again, well, it's only a burn attack with knight b3, bishop f3, queen d2, g4, and so on. But there's also the important move knight to f3, which I've discussed in a couple of previous videos, since it's a variation that I've played from time to time. One was a game I played against Gauri Shankar from one of those international Master Norm tournaments in Chicago. Another one was a game against a local expert. So I won both games, and in both games I think my opponent played quick h6, which, while natural, is considered inaccurate, and I think is inaccurate, not just considered to be, but I think rightly so. At any rate, as I've mentioned a few times now about knight to f3 setups against a pawn to e5, white's idea is to try to colonize the d5 square. So things like bishop g5, at some point taking, putting the bishop on c4, and essentially trying to monopolize control over d5 with pieces. So the goal isn't to end up with a pawn there. That would be a complete failure of white's plan, at least unless he's getting something really fantastic to compensate. So, okay, what is black going to do about this plan? Well, one idea is to play h6, which I've mentioned and which we saw in a very similar position in a bishop to e2 variation. But here, though, it's not so good. So bishop to c4, this is a difference. See, in the bishop to e2 line, with h6, white hasn't, white has already wasted a tempo with bishop to e2. See, the bishop on c1 is going to end up on e3 in both cases. So I haven't lost a tempo here in this case with the bishop on c1 because it ends up on e3 in both cases, but the bishop on f1 goes to c4 in one jump. And so that extra tempo, not stutter stepping from e2 and then going to c4, makes a big difference for white. So bishop c4, bishop e7, castles, castles, and now either knight to h4 straight away, or maybe queen to e2, something like this. And I think white has a little bit of an edge here. So that's h6. What else can black try? Well, you can just develop naturally with bishop to e7. This isn't so bad. Okay, but the point is now white plays bishop to c4, so that's at least to his advantage. Castles, castles, bishop e6. And here we have a position that's important in theory. White can try at least three different moves here. So there's simply bishop to b3, just dropping it back. There's queen to e2, and these can often transpose. And there's also a move that Ivanchuk played against Topalov, I believe early in 2008, with success, which was bishop takes e6, and then knight to a4. So it drops the e4 pawn, theoretically speaking at least, but with the knight coming to b6, that could be quite unpleasant. So this was actually a very interesting idea, and it's something that black should know about if he's going to head for this variation. Okay, finally, another try for black is queen to c7, preventing bishop to c4. So here, white usually tries to do some clamping on the queen side. So a4, a5. Okay, and now white needs some other idea. Okay, so he's not going to get the bishop to c4. And without the bishop getting to c4, it's tough to really get full control over d5. So for instance, if white plays bishop to g5, that's really not all that thrilling. I mean, black can play bishop to e6, or maybe knight b to d7, and maintain adequate control over the d5 square. Yeah, just make sure there's no other tricks that are even better. But so anyway, white doesn't play bishop to g3 in this position. So instead, the main move is bishop to e2, just getting on with his development. Knight b to d7, castles, and now, okay, now that development is it has been more or less completed, or is on the way to being completed, white has some ideas. So he could still play bishop g5, knight d2, c4, e3, and so on. Another idea might be to play rook a4 and bishop to c5, bishop to c4. So black plays b5 here. So breaking this bind, taking more control over c4, and also preventing any rook to a4 ideas as well. So takes, takes, knight to d2. So we know this idea. Bishop b7, takes, takes, knight c4, queen c7, knight e3. So white's on the verge of completing the big idea. And even if black plays knight takes e4, white seems to be okay. So something like this. At least this has occurred before. I'm not sure that it represents best play. I would look at it more carefully. But it's at least a fairly plausible variation. Okay, now here I would be more tempted to play bishop takes e4 and not exchange my knight for black's, but okay. Maybe on bishop e4, f4, queen takes b7 is satisfactory. Though, okay, even there I think white maybe has a small edge. But alright, in whatever game it was, knight c3 was played, then b3, and then I assume he took with the e-pawn. Maybe they agreed to a draw. But okay, white has a minuscule edge here, but it's something that he can play with. I mean, his light square control is more meaningful at the moment than black's dark square control. Though if black can get his bishop onto the a7 g1 diagonal without something bad happening first, then his chances should be equal, or pretty close to equal. Okay, so that's knight f3. Let's look at knight to b3 instead, the main move. All right, so bishop e6, f3. Okay, and now black has, again, three important moves to choose from, though two of them can transpose. So one move is knight b to d7. And now here we have one of those places where, again, the g4 versus queen d2 battle raged for some time, but it looks like that one has been settled pretty conclusively. So if g4, okay, knight to b6 is all right, g5, and then black can go this way or that way. But on b5, g5, b4 seems to be pretty good for black. Okay, but again, it's playable for both sides. Also, queen to d2. Okay, so queen d2, bishop b7, g4. So this has been played a bunch of times too. Actually, yeah, sorry, it's not in the knight. Okay, well, yeah, it's not in the knight b to d7 line where the issue was settled, but it's in the bishop to e7 line that the queen d2 versus g4 matter has been resolved. Yeah, after knight b to d2, both moves are possible. Yeah, okay, so let me talk about that. So bishop to e7, and now, all right, the difference is that, okay, if queen to d2, waiting for knight b to d7, the problem is that black, well, he can castle, and this is fine. Okay, castles, knight b to d7, g4, b5, g4, and then either knight to h5 or b4. In fact, this is a major variation, but usually one that occurs through a different move order. Wait a minute. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm getting myself confused with all of my notes here. Thought something was strange there. Okay, yeah, queen to d2 is the main move, and it's the correct move. All right. The wrong move, sorry, is g4 because now black can play d5. And he's completely fine. If white plays g5, no problem. Black plays d4. G takes f6. Bishop takes f6. Black regains the piece, has no problems whatsoever. And in fact, white's kingside is looking a little bit dubious here. And he hasn't castled queenside yet, so that's significant. Bishop to h4 could prove annoying. So this is very good for black. So the right move after bishop to e7 is queen to d2. And now, if d5, this is kind of interesting, but watch. E takes d5, knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, and now the queen that went from d1 to d2 now takes on d5. Well, why is this good? Why is this better? Well, the point is that although white could have had this position with an extra tempo, that extra tempo would have been g2 to g4, which would mean that the f3 pawn would be loose, and there could be bishop to h4 check as well, which might prove annoying. Here, though, after castling queenside, white probably has a slight edge. I remember Nigel Short has won some nice games from this position. I think I recall him winning one against Judith Polgar. Excuse me. So, after queen to d2, d5 is not played, whereas after g4, it is. So queen d2, castles, and now we get to the variation that I was starting to cover. And this is a main line, was very, very popular in 2006, I think, late 2006, in 2007, and even 2008. I'm not sure if it's still as popular, though I think there is still some life in it. So here's how it goes. Knight b to d7, g4, b5, g4. Now black can play knight h5, but b4 leads to the main drag. Knight e2, knight e8, and now f4. Now, in a lot of Najdorfs, black is perfectly happy to take on f4. But here after bishop takes f4, knight to e5, h4, it just seems that white is a little bit more comfortable than black would like. So this knight's going to come to d4. This knight maybe come to g3. These pawns are all rather far advanced. And it looks like white's chances are a little bit better here. So typically, after f4, black, surprisingly perhaps, ignores this and plays a5. And now, okay, after f5, black plays a4. He doesn't capture the knight or move the bishop to c4. Okay, now here white has a choice. So there's f takes e6, which is the less trendy variation, but it's important too. So a, b, ef, rook f7, king b1, takes, bishop g5, takes, knight to g3. And white certainly has a better position here, but he's down a pawn, so it's very interesting. White does look, easier to play here. I mean, bishop c4 is in the air. The g file looks like it could be a resource. White's bishop is better than either of black's knights. So this is probably pretty good. So I'd have to research this a little bit more to see where it is that black can improve significantly, because this at least looks, that final position looks more promising for white than this trendy line with knight b to d4, which continues like this. So ed, knight c4. Okay, now you can see that black's bishop is more or less stuck. Bishop takes a2, knight to c6, so white's regaining the piece one way or another. So black just blasts off here with b3. Doesn't worry about knight c6, doesn't worry about f takes e6. And, well, b takes a2 is a huge threat. White will be unable to prevent queening after that. So king to b1. Now b takes c2 check, knight c2 and bishop to b3. So there's no more knight to c6 business to take care of. And, okay, black is giving back the piece. I had no choice there, but he's got the open a file, he's got the open c file. This pawn on b3 is kind of a pain in the neck. So all of a sudden it looks pretty good for black. Well, knight to a3, of course we want to bottle up the a file. Knight e5, bringing this piece to a good square. And after h4, there's still plenty of theory from this point, and it's simply a very sharp and very dynamic line where, again, you want to do your research before you play this. All right, so that is almost all I want to say about the English attack. So we've looked at knight b to d7, and we've looked at bishop to e7, but there's a third important move, h5. This is a move that Topalov, if he didn't invent it, he certainly is the prime mover behind it. He's played it quite often with very good results, and has shown that this kind of bizarre-looking move is really not only well motivated. I mean, the motivation is obvious. You prevent g4, but it's also quite playable and maybe even strong. Okay, well, since g4 is out, white should go to some other part of the plan. Now, let's at least discuss a few points about this. One is that this isn't quite as weakening as it might seem, because h6, g6, and f6 are still fully guarded by pawns. So that's the one thing about pushing an h-pawn or an a-pawn, is that it doesn't weaken any new squares. Now, in one sense, it weakens g5 because h6 is no longer available, but if the bishop goes to g5, it's not that significant, while it's more difficult for white to get a pawn there. Now, white could consider something like h3 and g4 at some point, but if h3, then black can play h4 and fix it, as long as he hasn't castled. If he has, then bishop g5, bishop takes h4 becomes a possibility. All right, well, how does this continue from here? So knight b to d7, castles. Sometimes black plays bishop to e7, or let's say rook c8, king b1, bishop to e7. And black, as often as not, will certainly castle on the king side and take his chances there while going for a queenside counterplay. So, you know, it's a very interesting way to handle a position. I mean, at some point, g4 will show up probably anyway, but has black managed to gain enough time in the meanwhile to get his queenside play jump started? So, fascinating variation. Not as common as the other lines yet, but it is important, and it does get played quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, it's already been played hundreds of times now, this h5 move. So it's, you know, looking in PowerBook 2009, in this position, bishop t7 shows up 1,789 times, knight b to d7 1,181 times, and h5 312 times. So less, but it's a relatively new discovery, and it has the best score for black. So black performs 7 to 10 percentage points better than those other moves, and 16% better than knight to c6 here. All right. Well, enough fascinating statistics there. There's one more move that we need to look at with bishop to e3, and that's knight to g4. Okay. Well, what in the world is the point behind this move? Well, it's pretty obvious. We want to kick this bishop. And, okay, where does the bishop go? Well, one place it goes is to c1, after which black probably has nothing better than knight to f6, and this forces white to choose again. Do we go bishop to e3 and see if black wants a repetition? Do we go bishop to g5, bishop e2, bishop c4, rook g1, a4, h3, g3, and so on? Or what? Well, we'll see another way that white can try to get into an English attack in a moment. But first, let's finish with bishop to g5, which is the main move here. Okay, black plays h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and bishop to g7. And now we see what black is up to. In exchange for some weak light squares, h5 and especially f5, black is going for this bind on the dark squares. So he's controlling f4, oops, let's use red squares, f4, h4, e5, f6, this diagonal in general, and that's what he's going for. That's his compensation. So, okay, white has a couple of main plans here. Bishop e2 is one, with the idea after h5 to just get rid of this annoying knight, which could go to e5. So he's gotten rid of one of black's main contestants for the e5 square, and done so by swapping off a bishop that, again, is maybe one of white's problem pieces in the Najdorf. So takes, f3, bishop f2, castles, and okay, this is an important position. This has occurred a number of times, and black has a variety of choices here. So white's got some pressure against the d6 pawn. Black's kingside could prove a little bit fluffy. On the other hand, these g and h pawns sometimes advance. I recall some Kasparov game where one pawn goes to g4, the other pawn goes to h3, and he really tenderized white on the long light square diagonal. So, fascinating position and an important one. But the main move has been h3 for a while, though I think black has shown some good resources lately. But I'll just show one of the variations that was quite significant and in white's favor for a period of time. So knight e5, knight f5, takes, knight b to c6. And at first glance, it's not really obvious what white is up to. I mean, he's got the bishop here, but the f1 bishop is really not going anywhere very promising. The bishop on g3 is okay, but it's biting on the knight on e5. Black's bishop on g7 is quite well posted. The pawn on f5 could prove to be weak. And, all right, what's white's compensation for all of this? Well, start with knight to d5, putting the knight on a very good square, and preventing queen to d7 because of knight to b6. So the f5 pawn is safe for the moment. Also, it's possible in some variations that white will just play f6, sack the pawn to destroy black's structure. So e6, fe, knight e3, and now, okay, black can castle here. White plays bishop to e2, and you can see that he's got nice control over some light squares. I believe this is how Kazimjanov Anand from San Luis 2005 went, and Kazimjanov won a very nice game. Okay, the really sharp and fun variation is with queen to a5 check, and this was also played, although I believe in a position without fe6, fe6, again in San Luis, and it's played by Topalov, and he either drew or won the game. But they found some very nice ideas for white. In fact, Svidler against somebody, maybe Kazimjanov, but I'm not sure, with white was able to win. So here's the idea. So c3, knight f3 check. This was the big point. Queen f3, bishop c3 check. King d1, queen a4, knight c2, takes, and now this was, I think, the big find. Not rook to b1 or anything like that, or just leaving it in place, but rook to c1. And then after takes, queen f6. This was the big idea. And after king c1, although materially black is doing fine, he's got a rook and two pawns for two bishops, his king is a little bit weaker, and white's bishops are going to be extraordinarily powerful, and white went on to win the game. Okay, so that's all I want to say about bishop e3, knight to g4. As I said, the line is still developing, and black is finding further resources. But, okay, let's suppose that his resources are perfectly fine, and that bishop to g5 promises white nothing. Let's assume that for the moment. Well, okay, if white wants to play, after bishop c1, knight f6, what is he going to do if he wants to play an English attack kind of structure? Well, the answer is that he can try the move f3. And then he hopes to play bishop to e3 next move. So if black plays e5, for instance, then knight b3, bishop b6, bishop b3, and away we go. We're back to well-known ground. Or again, if e6, bishop to e3, and we're in the Scheveningen version, the English attack version, as opposed to the Bern variation version. So I probably have accidentally called bishop to e3 the English attack, but again, really only with the e5, only with e6 is it really an English attack. Anyway, after f3, black can be kind of a spoil sport if he wants to, and try queen to b6. So this at least prevents the bishop to e3 idea from showing up again, because it hangs the b pawn in a bad situation. So white has a couple of moves here. He can play g4 and try to, let's say, create the rest of the English attack. Another idea maybe is a3. So this involves a typical poison pawn style cheapo, which is that if, for example, e6, we can't play bishop to e3 because queen takes b2 loses the queen to knight a4. So you might think, I figured it out, something for nothing. Well, not exactly, because even if black has to waste a tempo after bishop to e3 with a move like queen to c7, that's okay, because white isn't going to castle queenside. Playing a3 is at least a queenside weakness, so it's not clear who's really benefiting the most from that. Also, black can maybe play knight to c6, again because castling queenside isn't as attractive as it might otherwise, or might normally be. So, alright, what's white to do? So g4 is okay, but knight to b3 is probably going to be the most common continuation here. Okay, e6, and now white has to do a further something awkward here to get bishop to e3 in. I mean, you'd like to play queen at e2 and hop the bishop over to e3, but it's against the rules. So the queen is going to have to go either to e2 or to e3, where it blocks the bishop f1. Also, okay, so I want to mention about the knight b3, something that I believe I mentioned either 1 or 2 shows ago, or 1 or 2 Sicilian shows ago, or maybe in both cases, which is that even though black is going to lose a tempo at some point, dropping the queen back to c7, the benefit is that white's knight withdraws to b3. And if it goes back to d4, then white ends up losing 1 net tempo, because it took it two moves to get to d4, or to stay on d4, whereas it took, he's losing 2 moves, whereas black's only losing 1 move, putting the queen on c7. Okay, on the other hand, if the knight stays on b3, it's not as aggressive. Alright, so queen to e2, and now, okay, black can either go for a classical approach with knight c6, and something like this is playable for both sides. Probably white has slightly better chances, but again, it's playable. And the immediate drop back with queen c7, and then going for a more Najdorf or Scheveningen approach with b5 and putting the knight on d7. So, for example, something like this could be played. Okay, so I point out f3. You should be aware of that if you're if you like to play these English attack types of setups, and if you know your opponent's going to play bishop to e3, knight to g4, so you can at least consider which sideline you prefer. If you like f3, queen b6 better, or bishop b3, knight g4, bishop g5 better. All right, so that's it. It's been a reasonably long show, and obviously if we talked about bishop to g5, we would go for several more hours, so or at least another hour probably. So let's go ahead and stop it here, and hopefully your appetite is whetted for 6 bishop to g5, the absolute main line. So see you next time. Bye-bye.